Good evening, directors, staff, and members who are joining us here and those who are watching online. I will now call this January 25th, 2022 Committee of the Whole meeting to order. For anyone speaking tonight, please remember to speak directly into your microphone. For the benefit of all of us, but especially for our interpreters, those using closed captions, and those who normally rely on seeing faces to help them understand, we really do need to project our voices to be heard through masks. And finally, if you do briefly remove your mask to speak, please remember to put it back on properly after you're done. Please let the record reflect that Director Pauly is excused from the meeting tonight as he is following health guidance and quarantining after a COVID-19 exposure. He is watching this meeting online. Director Jourdain has also let me know that he will not be in attendance this evening. Clerk Inns, will you please call the roll for the record?
Director Arneson?
Here.
Director El-Amin?
Here.
Director Ali?
Here.
Director Cerrillo?
Here.
Director Inns? Director Jourdain? Director Caprini?
Present.
Director Pauly? And Director Ellison?
Here. Thank you. We have two items on the agenda this evening. First, an update on COVID-19 response, and then a final review of our next strategic plan, on which we will vote next month. We'll begin with an update on COVID-19, the response from Superintendent Graff. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Ellison. Good evening, board members, members of the public joining us virtually. I wanted to just start this evening by providing kind of an update on where we are with our COVID-19 response. Having just completed the 7th day of our temporary move to district-wide online learning, I wanted to highlight some of the updates as well as notifying the board about our ongoing planning in response to the pandemic. So I know that everyone, in particular our students, are very excited to be back in person. I know that that was a significant shift and extreme disruption to our learning environment, but we're looking forward to having our students and staff back in person starting on Monday, January 31st, as we begin our third quarter. And this week is the final one of the second quarter, so please remember that there is no school online or in person this Friday, January 28th. That is a scheduled teacher record keeping day, so we do not have school on Friday. And as I mentioned, while the temporary move to online learning wasn't what any of us wanted, the reality is that the volume of staff and student absences both at school and at the district level made it virtually impossible. Let me restate that, not virtually impossible, but it made it impossible for us to operate as a district. And I think what we've learned is that the pause, as the data tells us, has led to fewer student and staff absences. We have higher substitute teacher fill rates, and as expected, we've also seen a significant reduction in the number of cases that have been reported in our schools. And although it may seem a little counterintuitive, this temporary move to online learning is actually what prioritizing in-person learning looks like, as it's going to help us navigate through what we hope will be the peak of the Omicron variant surge and allow us a better position as we return and more importantly, sustain our in-person learning as best as we can moving forward. That being said, in accordance with the requirements of state law, we've also maintained our in-person option for those who wanted or needed to attend in person, as well as we've been providing and making meals available to any of our students who want that. Looking at the number of students we have in our schools during this online learning period, it's approximately 1,500 students who've physically been in our schools each day over the past week. And I do want to acknowledge that as we're looking at tomorrow, for those who are planning to be in person tomorrow for school, just recognizing that we have extremely cold temperatures predicted for tomorrow, especially in the morning. And since we have most of our students learning online, we will not be calling an e-learning day for the cold. So just wanted to highlight that. And we will have our schools open for those students who need to be there in person tomorrow, though we definitely want to highlight and mention to anyone who's planning to come to school to make sure that you dress extra warm and be ready for the extreme cold conditions in the morning. So upon our return to in-person learning on Monday, January 31st, We will return to our practice of monitoring the data both on a school-by-school and a district-wide level. And of course, again, unless we see a significant staff shortages in the system-wide operational functions, such as in our transportation or with our food service, future temporary shifts to online learning would likely happen only for a particular school or classrooms, based on the individual staffing or because of an outbreak of positive COVID-19 cases within the school community. So again, just wanted to reinforce it is our goal to remain in person with our students learning as much as possible throughout the rest of this year. I would also say that in preparation of the return to in-person learning, we have ordered additional voluntary COVID test kits and more personal protective equipment, including KN95 masks for students. The state has also made both the adult and student KN95 masks available to school districts, and we are in the process of obtaining those supplies, as well as in partnership with our public health officials and health partners. We are continuing to review any relevant guidance and recommendations from both the Minnesota Health Department and the CDC guidance. And we will certainly share updates with staff and families as changes are made to those practices based on these updates. And then I would say finally, Chair Ellison, just as we do for transitions back to school after winter break or summer breaks or spring breaks, our staff are preparing and planning in order to support students as they make their way back into our buildings. And this intentionality is especially important now since some of our students have been making frequent transitions in and out of schools between quarantines, our current online learning shift, as well as just our transition back from winter break. So with that, I'm happy to answer or respond to any questions that board members may have, and I have staff here can also support.
Thank you, Superintendent Graff. Directors, please hit your request to speak button if you have any questions or comments about the COVID-19 update you just heard. Seeing none, thank you, Superintendent, for that update. And thanks for keeping everyone in our schools, our staff and students safe and learning. So thank you. Next, we're going to take a few minutes to do a final review of our strategic plan. We're first going to ask Superintendent Graff to quickly run through the highlights and next steps, and then we'll take time to have any final discussion before we vote on the plan at our next business meeting next month. Directors, you'll recall that we have spent our last several committee of the whole meetings working on the individual components of the plan, reaching consensus along the way. So we've asked Superintendent to bring back the entire plan before us tonight so we can review it as a whole. We won't have him represent the whole plan or the individual strategies and measures as we just covered those last month, but they are in the appendix if you're interested in referencing them during the discussion. As noted, when we formally began the process of finalizing the strategic plan at our retreat in August 2020, and as we've discussed several times the months since our strategic plan, it's our collective roadmap for the next 3 to 5 years. So it's critically important that we as leaders understand it, commit to it, because it's the only way that's going to be successful. And finally, before we begin, I'd like to again thank Superintendent Graff and your team for all your efforts to develop this plan while also working through this pandemic. Superintendent Graff, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair Ellison. And as requested, we've pulled together all the elements developed over the past 6 months since the board retreat in August. So what I will do is I'll just kind of ask the support staff to move the slides as I highlight some of the things. So we've provided this comprehensive document in the meeting materials, and we've covered kind of the plans in detail already for the past committee of the whole meetings. I'm just going to hit the highlights. So as you recall, the plan was built around 3 key foundational elements, including to honor the voices from which we heard over the past few years, to incorporate prior work and align the existing priorities, and finally to focus on implementation and action. The vision, mission, commitment, and values as being shown here on the slides, were developed and adapted from board feedback. In particular, we added the piece around commitments. And all of this brought us to the 4 plan goals on academic achievement, student well-being, effective staff, and school and district climate. With an overarching framing that you can see here on slide 11, within each goal we develop corresponding strategies, conditions needed for success, and targets, which we covered in detail at last month's Committee of the Whole meeting. And I want to again thank the team from Senior Officer Moore for his leadership in working with accountability, research, and equity, as well as Dr. Fearing, who's spent a great deal of time making sure that we worked very closely with our associate superintendents around the conditions, as well as just the academic focus. Following the tenets of implementation science, this plan explicitly recognizes that certain conditions need to be in place to see progress and achieve goals. And upon adoption and subsequent commencement of the plan, we intend to provide quarterly progress updates to the board here in the Committee of the Whole meetings as key reporting and accountability features. So it lends itself nicely to our current structure of having Committee of the Whole meetings and being very deliberate and intentional in providing those updates and monitoring our progress. And then finally, once adopted by the board, we'll work to communicate with our staff, our students, our families, and the community through a variety of mediums and in the primary languages of our city. And so I think that that's something, again, that is really important as we move this forward as part of the future roadmap, is that everyone understands the values, the mission, the commitment, and the vision that we've created here, and what that accountability and those metrics and measurements look like so that we can create conditions for success. So finally, Chair Ellison, I would like to also thank the board and acknowledgement of your efforts and your direction. As I mentioned already, the senior leadership team and everyone else who's put a great deal of effort and work into this plan. And just along with everything else that's been going on, very appreciative. So we're happy to answer any questions that board members might have.
Thank you, Superintendent, and thanking your staff again. Directors, if you have any thoughts or questions about the plan, any comments, please hit your request to speak button. This is going to be a really quick meeting. Director Elamine?
So I guess I do have a couple of questions as I was able to take a look at the strategic plan and kind of reflecting back on our conversation as a board. One of my concerns still that I see, again, when we think about our vision and our mission, I really want to steer away from just putting something on the walls and being able to point or pinpoint more directly. What is it that we're trying to achieve? How we can measure that we are achieving that success, and how families can see that this vision and this mission that we have implemented can be felt in all of our schools. So I guess I'm looking for a little bit more directions on how we will be able to measure our success or our weakness when it comes to the academics or when it comes to our students' well-being and the climates within our schools.
So thank you, Director Elamine, for your questions. I think there are 2 parts to this. One is that we have this time put together very clear conditions that we know we need to create, and that is something that we've already begun working on, is just establishing the kind of conditions that need to happen in our schools in order to actually realize those metrics that we also have. So that's the first thing I would say. In terms of what are we going to actually report on or what we're going to show, We do have extensive list of metrics and, I guess, data in the past presentation, and I think it's also included in the attachment here. I don't know, Ryan, can you pull up some of those metrics for us? Do you have that available so I can walk through that and show some of the specifics that Director Elamene's asking for? I think Senior Officer Moore and his team, in consultation with, again, all the senior leaders, put together the goals and the strategies, and then we had some of the measurements that we would be looking at for data reporting. So you can see here on Goal 1 for academics, what the goal is for academic achievement, and then the strategies that we have. So the first strategy is providing standards-based core instruction with a focus on literacy and mathematics. And
The next slide is
and then
data has a, or I don't know which one this is.
so then it shows the conditions that we talked about, which were, I think, new for this district to be able to speak to the conditions and help to build the understanding and the expectation of what we need in order to be successful. So the first part of it is having an academic schedule, making sure that we have clear supports, what's happening in the classroom with our strategic plan. Ryan, can you move to the more quantifiable one? So this might be more what you're looking for, Director Elamine. You can see very specifically 1.1 is the strategy, and percent of 2nd through 8th grade students measured as proficient by the fall A reading fast. So we have our overall achievement gap between Black, Indigenous, and students of color and white students. So we've listed out pre-pandemic, it was 49%. And then in our current year, overall, it's 48%. And then looking at the goals, we set those goals out for 5 years. And so for us to move from where we are now to that 5-year goal, it has to be an increment of 15 percentage points. And the idea would be, as mentioned earlier at our Committee of the Whole meetings, we could come back and we could share that information as to what the progress is. And the reason that we've highlighted where we want to be in 5 years is because we know that progress is not linear. And although, mathematically we think if we move here, we would move here, we're actually having to shift different students every year in terms of their progress. And so it would be more of a presentation of here's where we are with the data at this time. And then we would see explanation of what has contributed to that. So it'd be a cross area conversation. If we went back to the conditions and we found ourselves not meeting all of the conditions that we felt we needed, we might be able to leverage those conversations further and provide better support for those conditions. It could be that we're meeting the conditions and we're seeing that as a part of the reason that we're seeing the progress and success. So that's an example there with literacy, and then it moves to other areas that we would look at. Our Black and Indigenous students and students of color, 22 percentage points is what we would need to have over that 5-year time period. And I think the other piece to consider is that we're using this as part of the targets in 5 years, and it's based on also implementation science and how you have several years of foundational work that would also lead to an understanding or an expectation of progress.
So if I can ask, and I know we are right now kind of in mediation with the teachers, but I do want to ask the question anyway. So when it comes to evaluation with our teachers, is this something that we can use to evaluate the progress of the schools as far as the teachers and seeing where we're headed, basically trying to get the results of this plan that we have put in place? How does that line, I don't know if you can talk about it, because again, I do understand we're in negotiations right now, so.
Yeah, I want to make sure I understand the question, and so I'll just speak from my experience as an administrator. Mm-hmm. And so when we had goals in our district of things that we wanted to achieve, and we had measures or targets that we set, part of the practice that would happen is that we would take a look at that data for our specific school, and we'd compare that to what the district progress was supposed to be. And then from there, we would have individual, whether it's departments, or we would have grade level conversations, and we would see where are we seeing these trends, what does that progress look like? And then further yet, I would have individual conversations with teachers and saying, show me where your students started out, show me where they progressed, where they progressed. And so you take all of that down to say, as part of any evaluation or performance of someone, I think those are natural conversations. I mean, our ultimate goal is to make sure that our students are progressing and they're achieving. And it's my job as the administrator to support and provide what that direction needs to be for the teacher. So if that helps, I mean, those are natural conversations that occur and should be occurring in our schools, especially as we now have, or we will have, an adopted strategic plan. Using that as an example for senior leaders, they will all have work plans, and those are conversations I will be having with them.
Okay.
So it's part of that expectation of evaluation. What does it lead to? It hopefully and expectedly would lead to progress. And if not, then that's where we go back to what are the contributing factors that are preventing that from happening. And I feel like the addition we have with this strategic plan around the conditions for success is putting it out there. It's being very clear that, these are things that will contribute to outcomes for our students. And so we've named a lot of those so that we don't have ourselves in a situation of wondering why we're not progressing. Well, if we have 6 conditions for success and we're not doing any of them, I think I think we would all say, like, that's a problem. And it wouldn't be something that we would have to go to an individual and say, these things aren't happening. It would be a look at the district holistically.
Thank you. Yep, thank you.
Director.
Thank you, Chair Ellison. I am, it's probably pretty, I don't know, I'm pretty excited about this strategic plan, in part because I, like a lot of people in this room, have seen a lot of strategic plans be put together, torn apart, put back together again, piecemealed. It's kind of like the way my brain thinks about it is when a child is learning to ride a bicycle and someone puts a stick in the spoke and they're never actually able to get to the end of the block and actually enjoy the ride because there are mitigating circumstances that are constantly getting in the way of seeing progress. I've had the pleasure and the privilege to sit amongst teachers and other staff members in a school that I would love to tell you the name of, but I don't want to out them. And conversations around exactly what you were describing, Superintendent Graff, where they were sharing information about students, where they needed the extra support, and this was all being cross-referenced with all of their teachers in other classes and social workers, not sharing their specific issues or what have you, but it was like this collective group of people coming together and moving towards a goal. And wherever there was that stick that was stuck in a spoke, they were able to actually keep the bike moving. So if you kind of follow my logic, which might be goofy to some, we have an opportunity to not stick a spoke in the bicycle. This is going to take absolutely every single person, obviously, in our schools at the district level to do their part to be able to get to that place where we can reach these goals. And I think it's possible because we've been through so much in the last 2 years, and we were on the brink of seeing progress, a small increment of progress prior to the pandemic, and then we got clobbered. So I like to believe that we're in a space where people are ready to get to work. I had a phone call with a principal the other day who worked in a school one of my kids attended years ago, and they actually said that they were so excited to be in a space where people were actually excited about collaborating with students from other grade levels, like teachers from other grade levels, to support students. And while this person was talking, I thought about a board meeting that happened a few weeks ago. Maybe it was a committee of the whole, but the deputy works with Dr. Fearing. I can't think of her name. I'm sorry. Please tell me. Yes. She was talking about her experiences in the St. Louis Park District. And from further investigation through friends that I have that work in other districts, I remembered her name at the time when I was doing my little digging. She presented to the board her strategies for getting fourth grade students who are reading at a second grade level to move the dial. And that's part of what it's going to take, is for this cross collaborations. And I see a lot of the work within the strategic plan being exactly a lot of that work. And when it comes to the school improvement plan and the family involvement plan, all of those, all of that work, it has to actually happen. And I know I've told the story before about being on one of my first site councils and having a piece of paper slipped across the table to sign, and I didn't because I didn't know what it was. And now knowing that there are more families, more people that actually know what those things are, because we've ripped the cloth off of the lack of knowledge. Because in the past, it was easy to just kind of like show up and just do what you can. I'm excited about the strategic plan. I think that the work is it's not gonna be easy. It is gonna take a lift to make sure that people are adhering to it. And these measurements are going to show us whether or not they are. So I say all of that to say I appreciate the work that has gone into all of this. And I absolutely appreciate the dialogue that has occurred over the last 2 years in regards to getting to this space. I'm excited about what's possible. And I hope that families and schools can reach that level of positivity and excitement as I do. However, if we get to a space where we're not moving in the direction that we believe that we need to, the proof is going to show up where it needs to be, and accountability will be had. Thank you.
Chair Ellison, thank you. Director Caprini, I just wanted to reinforce what you kind of reminded me of. That this was done in a lot of collaboration. I referenced Senior Officer Moore, Dr. Fearing, but also we have the senior leadership team from our Associate Superintendent, Informational Technology, Human Resources, Operations, Communication. So this is definitely the driving work of this organization from a senior leadership team. And certainly as we support our schools through many different departments, that will be the work going forward too. So it is not just us communicating with the board. It is not just us having these kind of expectations of reporting, but it is the work that we have to do with our schools and in collaborative and very clear and intentional manner. And I think we'll be talking about this at our next board meeting also, around how we create those conditions and what does that look like in terms of professional development and a calendar and things of that nature. So it's all very much aligned, and so the timing of it is quite good.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am appreciative and grateful as well for all the work put into this and to have been back and forth with a well-rounded education piece. Thank you. Talking about plastering things on the wall, for me, my question is, are we going to be able to actually have this literally on the walls in every single school? I have been in some schools here in the city, actually, where you walk in and you have very, literally written as you enter the school, the mission and the vision statements. And I feel that is really important for us to adopt. So that is my question. Thank you.
Director Cerrillo, thank you for the recognition, acknowledgement, and also thank you for the reminder. This was a conversation I believe you and I had a few months ago. I remember it saying it would be great if we had some of this consistency of whatever it is, you know, in our buildings so that people knew what to expect. And so that is part of this plan around our communication and how we present that. I think we're certainly excited about how we can market this. To me, I do not want this to be a document that sits on a shelf. And I'll just reference when I came into Minneapolis Public Schools 2016, Senior Officer Moore at the time conducted a survey, and I know that it was less than 40% of staff knew that we had a strategic plan. That right there is a condition for failure, not a condition for success. So, and again, it's one that we can say what's not happening in the schools, but if we don't have a unified understanding or an aligned understanding of what we're trying to accomplish, then we're all going to be doing different things. So for me, it's a watershed moment to say absolutely, as we've noted in here, that we're going to have communication supporting that. I would envision that as we start our school year in August, we have some consistency around what that looks like. You know, whether that's a vision, mission, commitment kind of document that's available in all of our schools on the walls, or we figure some kind of strategy around how we would have that presented in our buildings. But absolutely, I think that we've got some creative people who would welcome that level of consistency and communication.
Thank you. Director Inns?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think one of the things I think is really good about this document, and I don't necessarily support 100% everything that's in it, you know, but I feel like probably most board members feel that way, and that our board, I think, brought a collaborative approach and was willing to compromise on things so that we could have a guiding document that we could support, maybe not necessarily, you know, I think in the spirit of sort of a collaborative board effort, this represents that very well. And so I wanted to say thanks to the other board members for being willing to be considerate and collaborative and compromising in putting this together, and for the staff for helping to facilitate that process as well. And I'm sure that for the staff, it's also a collaborative effort. And for the staff as well, they're like, why do we have to put this in? I don't agree with this. But I think everyone that is in leadership in the district was willing to collaborate so that we could bring forth something that was needed for the district. And it does represent, I think, very well a collective sense of our values. That said, I guess a question I have is, I'm looking at some of the conditions necessary, you know, some of the things that I might quibble with. How are those things, those specific things, you know, I think when I'm voting in support of this, and when I think of how the staff makes this stuff operational, how much weight do the individual things carry? What things, you know, I mean, I think for anything, you know, and as a social studies teacher, you know, you teach kids that laws don't really matter if people don't care about them, you know. The Supreme Court passes a ruling, for instance, and, you know, if nobody backs it up, if it's not, there's no, like, the Supreme Court doesn't have a military to enforce its rulings, you know. It's like, it's not like we have a school police force that's going to make sure that everything in this strategic plan has to happen, you know. So I just was wondering if Superintendent Graff, if other staff that worked on the development of this plan might be willing to comment on that and talk about, I guess, accountability, I guess, then for these specifics rather than just the overall goals. So how do we do that? And I think that gets back to a little bit of what Director Alameen was pointing to as well.
Thank you for your comments, Director Enns. If I'm following you, so you're talking about the conditions specifically more so? If I could use that as
Yeah, I think well, you know, I'm not going to talk about every single individual subheading or sub item, but just rather in general, if there were to be something like, how does something make it in there? And then how does it become significant, So for instance, the goals that we're going to look at, whether it's the specific data-driven goals, or it could be, some of the values or more sort of general value-related things in the conditions as well.
So I'll maybe ask Dr. Fearing to share a little bit. I think part of what we did is we did some research and looked at other strategic plans. And I think through our conversations over the years, range of educational experiences, we knew that having a metric was really important, having a target was really important, and we even had discussion as a board, like, what is that number? Is it aspirational or is it actual, and how do you push an organization? And so as we started to talk about what do we really need to have in place, I think a big part of that comes down to those conditions. So we understand strategies that we think we need to have in place, but I'll just take, for example, goal number 2, student well-being on slide 42, conditions necessary for goal 2 strategies. If our goal is every student's physical and mental well-being is addressed as an integral part of their education, how do you tangibly measure that? What does that mean? Well, I think when you look at the conditions, you first have to acknowledge, like, mental health support's appropriately resourced and staffed. We can't just come up with a number and say this is what this is the ratio that's going to make that happen. But we can say we've got to prioritize that in our budget conversations. We can say that we have to provide those resources in a way that is usable for educators. Diverse pool of mental health professionals available and hired. So we have to do our recruitment and our retention and make sure that we're onboarding them appropriately. A district adopted social and emotional curriculum. We have district curriculum we're using now. We have a couple of different variations of that. Again, it goes back to that alignment, that unified voice and message of supports. So I'm just giving you kind of examples of what we're going to be looking to do in our work as senior leaders around the budget development, the professional development, the training and support that we provide for building principals, because it's really easy to just jump to the metric and say, you made it, you didn't make it. And I think one thing data always does is it leads to more questions. And so we should be looking at that measurement and that target and the progress, and then we should be asking ourselves, what do we think has driven us to this point? What are some of the conditions that we are very successful with or very challenged with, and how can we address those? So Dr. Fearing, do you have anything further to add around the conditions? Because I know that's something that is new, and I think we've heard from some as, wondering about what happens if you don't have these conditions. And I think we clearly say that conditions aren't excuses, and they reflect realities. And that conjunction "and" was very intentional, because we are not making them excuses. We're saying they are our realities, that if we don't have some of this stuff happen, then we can't expect to maximize the progress that we would want to see. It doesn't mean we don't continue with it. It doesn't mean that we aren't still trying to improve those conditions, but it helps with the communication and the understanding of our next steps.
Okay. Thanks for the question, Director Inson. I was really trying to process through as I was listening to Superintendent Graff speak about it. And I think one of the things that really came up when we were looking specifically at the academic goals, and I remember spending a good amount of time in Senior Leader Moore's office, and we were talking about the conditions. And I spent a lot of time thinking about that because we had conversations with building leaders and principals, and we asked them, so if you want to get to point Z, what's point A, right? And what they identified in point A, and I think we presented at a earlier committee of the whole about the creation of the literacy action plan, was a lot of the conditions that you see here, that building leaders on their own had to figure this out and find strategies to get through these so that they could start the work on academic improvement, specifically in literacy. And so these are very clear to me conditions that I think our buildings need, and some of them are there and some of them still need some support and work with. But I do have to say, one of the things that was interesting in the last week or so, as we're starting to pull literacy data from the fall to winter, right? Because some of them are rolling in now, so we can see some of that data. And we have some schools that are making not just growth, but aggressive growth at some of our early kindergarten, first grade, second grade. And what's interesting is when you look at the schools that are making that aggressive growth, because I really want to hang on that for a second, because if we want to see schools improve, they can't just make normal growth, they have to make aggressive growth. If you're 2 laps behind in a race, you have to run twice as fast to catch up, right? So what we really want to do is look at the aggressive growth that schools are making, not just at the year, but between like monthly assessments, right? They won't be able to make yearly aggressive growth unless they're making a monthly or quarterly aggressive growth. And one of the things that I noticed as I was looking at the schools, those are schools that have really solidified some of these conditions on their own. But as I've mentioned before, that's going to give you pockets of success. And what we're trying to do, what I'm trying to do, is scale that up so that all of our schools have access to those conditions so that they can also move and make that aggressive growth. Even if they're a school that has a high level of proficiency, they still have students in their school that are not high proficiency. So those are the students then that need that specific aggressive growth. And there could be 1 or 2 of those conditions that are not in place for those specific students, right? So I think when I was thinking about your question too, Director Ince was really talking about like ownership. How do we all own it so that we can see the impact, ownership, accountability with that? The thing that I think about is that of the schools that can overcome these conditions and can start moving forward and start seeing aggressive growth, you start to see this mentality and this mindset shift of their teachers, right? So if you've been a teacher and been on a teacher team and you've really made it into that group of students that you know needed to have an additional strategy or do better on their assessments, once you start seeing students being successful, it gives you that motivation to want to keep replicating that within your classroom and within the grade level. So it's kind of a type of catching type of feeling and motivation. So I would suspect when we talk to the schools that saw, I think one school, I could be wrong, seen there more, but one school saw like 79% of their students make aggressive growth in, I don't know, it could be first grade or second grade, but one of the things you do is you talk to that team talks to their other counterparts, both vertical below them and vertical above them, and that motivation really picks up in people like, we can do this, we can really do this, look what we did, because that incoming grade level teachers now are going to receive students who are now at grade level, right? So you see kind of this building upon the successes of others. So that's one thing I've just seen as a practitioner, as a teacher, when you start seeing that success, that it kind of catches through the grade level team. Hopefully that answers your question.
No, thank you. I think, it's a difficult question to, I think, understand, and I'm not really sure exactly what I was asking, but I think that's really helpful, because I think, when we think about previous strategic plan and the things that I didn't like about it in particular were that, it had goals, right? But it didn't have, how do we get to those goals, right? And that's, I think, in education or any kind of humanistic endeavor, right? How you get there is at least as important as the goal itself. And so I appreciate that these are made explicit as well, and that we can discuss them, and we can, if we don't feel like these conditions are any longer appropriate, that can be a discussion that we have at some point as well. And it's good that they're out there. So thank you. That was actually really helpful. So.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I wanted to kind of read here basically repeat your quote, which you said, the community needs tangible action, not words. And I think that's basically, we can have the best strategic planning, but we need tangible work. We need actions. And I think this is a great document. I really like it. And I know this was we own these documents together, but also we need to make sure that this is implementation part is what the communities and the families and the students are expecting from us. And the times urgent, that's another kind of beast, which, and as I said again, we are together on this as board members, as the administrators, I hope to see that we have to implement this, make it work this time, and I'm hopeful, and I'm positive, and I remain positive that, we have to deliver it. We run out all the, excuses. I do understand we're in a difficult time. We had some challenges before. Now we have more challenges. But that, despite all these things, delivery time is urgent and necessary. And it would be great if Superintendent Graf can make comments, as well as the Madam Chair also. She can make comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Ali. Again, you saw that in the presentation. That was very intentional from our parent participatory executive summary. The community needs tangible action, not words. And I think that's what we're all kind of feeling, is that we don't want this to just be another approval of a document that we come back in, a year and say, we didn't hit the mark. So I think that is what you have here when we talk about these commitments. So how do you make something tangible and see action with it when you have to wait for those results to come in? And that's where I feel like the strategies and the conditions that we're highlighting are really tangible actions that will lead to those outcomes that we want. Before the meeting here, I heard one of our directors talk about a New Year's resolution. It was, to be healthy, and the actual acknowledgement that hasn't happened because there's been no exercise. So if you say you want to do something and you don't have the conditions, to get healthy, you have to perhaps exercise, you have to eat healthy, you have to educate yourself on those things. And for many times, we would say, like, this is the outcome that we want, but we didn't have any conditions. And so now the board and the staff and the public can see, are we creating those conditions? Are we actually eating healthy? Are we actually exercising? What does that exercise look like? That's what these conditions will allow us to do also, along with the strategies, making sure that we are addressing, if we have scheduling needs, make sure that we're addressing that. If we have some type of financial commitment that we need to make, that we're addressing that. And again, it's not linear, so you're not going to see that happen overnight. But if you have 6 conditions and you're meeting all 6 of those, then you can eliminate what some of those challenges might be, as to why you're not making the progress. So I believe that we are in a different mindset around this strategic plan than what I've seen in the past, because we have an expectation around how we can support those conditions and be tangibly addressing them and having conversations when that's not occurring.
Director Soria?
Chair, can you elaborate a little bit more on goal 1 and conditions number 5, stronger systems of accountability for low-performing staff? Can we elaborate a little bit more? Just expand that so I can better understand it. Thank you.
Yeah, let me see what page we're on here.
Page 19.
Thank you. So page 19. Stronger systems of accountability for low-performing staff and the HR staff needed to implement. So I think what we get to in a space sometimes is we start to identify as things aren't working because of a population or a group of individuals. And I think to the point I was trying to share with Director Elamine earlier, if I'm working at a school level and I work with my grade level and then I work with individuals and that success is not there, and I look at the conditions and I see that these conditions are still being met in some cases, so we should see success and it's not there, And we really have to have that support. It's a support model. So what does that plan look like if, for example, progress is not being made at one classroom and it's being made at several other classrooms, at the same school? I need to understand like what's not occurring. So I might need an additional observation to have someone come in and see, what I observed was the lesson was taught this way. And actually I now bring in a literacy coach who sees that the instructional practices that are occurring are not aligned the way that they should be. So you might have some outside professional development support for that individual. But that certainly requires HR staff to support from the overarching, what is the position, Senior Officer Sullivan? The individuals who, PAR mentor. So we need our PAR mentor support from HR. We'd also then make sure that we have our literacy coaching support so they could come together and assist in that training for an individual. So that's what the stronger systems of accountability mean, having those assurances in place and understanding how you can access those. So the accountability is there for the administrator to know what they can rely on. It's there for the teacher to know what support's in place. And then it's again, making sure that we have that time for professional development. So you'll see they're very much interrelated. They're interrelated from additional time for professional development, utilizing the curriculum and having the appropriate interventions, and then the accountability piece.
Okay. Thank you. I think Director Polly asked something like this. So I'm looking at these goals. I'm imagining next year's committee of the whole meetings might look a little different. If we're expecting if we're hoping a 20% growth in 5 years, we're not going to see necessarily 4 percentage points next year. How will we know we're going in the right direction, or what might our committee of whole discussions look like next year? Are we going to be focusing on conditions? Are we going to be looking a little bit on how students are progressing, just in general? Thanks.
Yeah, so it's definitely a fair question because we've said this is where we want to be in 5 years. I think it's going to be a combination of things. I think certainly we'll be looking at the space we're in as an organization in terms of the pandemic. I'll just take a step back, and last year we thought was like the year of all years, and we couldn't imagine how it could be any different or any more challenging. And now we're in this space this year, and we're kind of taking a step forward cautiously, only to be kind of moved back into online learning. So we set this out with the idea of this is where we want to be, but it'll be helpful for us to just kind of assess where we are as an organization. What is stable in the district, what is predictable. And then I do think it will be a conversation about, because we will be this will be starting in August, starting with that baseline information and the understanding of what we actually have in place. So the conditions will be critical going into the school year. As I've mentioned already, we've started some of our work around conditions as it relates to summer planning for professional development and gearing up. So we'll want to establish that baseline. I will say, if you look at the implementation science, it does lay that out also. So I think depending on which goal we're talking about, we might see we will see a variation in our advancement of the implementation of those goals. I think that's on, there it is on slide 12. So I think we'll have variation between goals, and as we set those out over the course of the committee of the whole, it'll probably be good for us to just work in a kind of a template of conversations. Here's where we are today, just as a district overall. Here's what we have for the conditions that we've associated with this goal, and we know from the last 6 months that we've not enacted any of these conditions because they were tied to the budget, or we were able to do a few of these as they related to, whatever it might be, negotiations or just the staffing of where we are in our staffing. So I would envision we'd work through some kind of model of communication that would be transferable for each one of the goals. That would be my initial thinking.
And how long do we want to spend on a goal? And if we don't, see it moving? How long before we look at the conditions? Maybe we chose the wrong conditions, maybe we needed to tweak it some a little differently. How long can we expect to stay in that space?
And I don't know if we have a formula for that. I think what we are probably wanting to start with is, taking a look at the implementation science framework, which does guide some of those expectations. When you go to exploration, installation, initial implementation, full implementation, at some point you have to reach that full implementation. And so I think it really is going to vary depending on the conditions. Are the conditions more of a technical approach to what we have to do, or are they adaptive? And the nuance being technical, we can just kind of say, we have this money set aside, there's the money, and we use it. The adaptive is, how do you actually put that into a transferable outcome, because a person is involved. We can set the procedures in place for hiring, but if we are not successful in hiring candidates who are aligned to what our mission and vision and all those other things, then we're not getting the complete, we're not maximizing what we're trying to do. So I would say that it's going to be varied, and we would probably have to have those conversations around what is possible from a technical aspect with the conditions and what is more of an adaptive one. And the adaptive one requires that consistent, persistent monitoring and coming back.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I wanted to say, like Director Caprini, I am excited about this plan. It seems very comprehensive, and I'm really looking forward to implementing this. And
Chair Ellison, if I could add just one other thing, just looking at this timeline here from the implementation science, you asked, at what point do you change? And I think you've got to give ample time for something to settle in. I would say 2 years would be your kind of gauge for it. But it doesn't mean we can't have the conversation, and but we would still want to monitor it going forward. And I think that's the most important part of this work, is that the committee of the whole, we shouldn't expect to say, hey, we met the goal of this metric 5 years. It should be, what is the progress, and evaluating and analyzing what are we seeing supporting the conditions and the outcomes.
thank you. I'm looking forward to having those discussions too. So thank you. Okay, directors, seeing no one else in the queue. Going once. I'm going to thank everyone for this presentation and the discussion. I'm now going to adjourn this meeting. Our next board meeting is at 5:30 on February 8th. And I just remind people, if you want to attend that meeting or any other meeting, to make sure in person, make sure you register either online or by calling the board office. And good night, everyone.